Hey guys, tonight we're dimming the lights on something sequined, exhausting, and profoundly misunderstood. The life of the Las Vegas showgirl. Not the fantasy version. Not the feathered goddess floating through a casino like a goddess who has never once paid rent. I mean the real ones. The women who showed up at 6 in the morning with bruised feet, borrowed eyelash glue, and a very specific kind of ambition that Las Vegas rewarded with a spotlight and absolutely nothing else. So before we go any further, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and a very warm thank you to the viewer who suggested this one. You know who you are, and I hope you're listening from somewhere comfortable, because this story deserves your full attention. Your suggestions genuinely shape this channel, and I'm grateful every single time one lands in my inbox. The channel is also now on Spotify, so if you'd rather drift off through your earphones tonight, the link is waiting for you in the description. Now dim those lights, put a fan on for that soft hum, and get as horizontal as your schedule allows. Let's think about this for a second. Have you ever wondered what it actually took to be a Las Vegas showgirl in the 1970s? Did they just show up looking magnificent and let the sequins do the work? How much does a feathered headdress actually weigh, and who decided that the answer to that question was more? Could you smile for 3 hours while balancing a crown the size of a small refrigerator on your head? Did showgirls eat, sleep, have opinions? Were they allowed to sit down? And what happened when the curtain came down, the rhinestones came off, and the city that never sleeps expected you to keep performing anyway? Congratulations. You've just woken up in Las Vegas, 1972. Your alarm went off at 5:30 in the morning. There are feathers in your hair from last night that you didn't notice until now. Your feet hurt in a way that has no medical name, and you are due at the Stardust in 45 minutes. Good luck. Las Vegas in the 1970s was not a place that arrived quietly. It announced itself in neon and noise, a city built on the desert like a dare, as if someone had looked at miles of sand and scrub and said, "What if we put a chandelier here?" And in the middle of all that glittering chaos, the showgirl was the symbol, the mascot, the human embodiment of everything Las Vegas wanted to sell. Glamour without consequence, beauty without effort, spectacle without sweat. The reality, as you are about to discover, was considerably sweatier. The Strip in the 1970s was a different animal from the family-friendly theme park it would later become. There were no roller coasters, no celebrity chef restaurants with 2-month waiting lists, no Instagram-ready fountains with choreographed water and soft lighting. What there was something rawer, louder, and considerably more interesting, a collection of hotel casinos owned by men whose financial arrangements were, to put it diplomatically, creative, staffed by performers who had come from every corner of the country, chasing the particular kind of dream that Las Vegas offered, which was not exactly fame, not exactly fortune, something more like a stage big enough to matter in a city that never looked away. The casinos themselves were ecosystems. You walked through the front doors and immediately understood that the architecture had been designed to disorient you in productive ways. No clocks, no windows, light that belonged to no particular time of day, carpet patterns so aggressively ugly that looking at the floor was not a relief. All of this was deliberate. The casino wanted your attention on the room, and the room was designed to hold it. At the center of this environment, quite literally and figuratively, was the showroom, the Stardust, the Tropicana, the Sands, the Dunes. Each hotel had one, and each showroom was the jewel in the property's crown, the thing that made a hotel a destination rather than just a place to lose money closer to a buffet. Into this world walked the showgirl. She was not hired to be a person, exactly. She was hired to be a presence, tall, luminous, moving through space in a way that made the room feel like it was hosting something significant. The hotels understood, with the instinct of people who had made a great deal of money understanding human psychology, that the showgirl represented something their customers wanted to believe about Las Vegas. That this was a place where ordinary rules did not apply, where beauty was unlimited, where the spectacular was the baseline. She was the living advertisement for the fantasy the city was selling. And she was everywhere, not just on the stage. Her image was on the billboards coming in from the airport, on the brochures stacked at the front desk, on the matchbooks, which is a detail that says a great deal about the era. She was the logo with legs, and like most logos, she was expected to be consistent, available, and entirely uncomplicated in her presentation. The actual woman inside the costume, the one with opinions and a bad knee and a roommate she was splitting a one-bedroom apartment with off Flamingo Road, that woman was backstage. The image was what the city needed. What Las Vegas had built, without entirely meaning to, was a role that demanded almost everything from the women who filled it and framed that demand as opportunity. And for many of the women who came, it genuinely was. The stage was real, the spectacle was real, the craft required to produce it was real and serious and hard-earned. But the city had arranged things so that the cost of that opportunity was paid entirely by the person accepting it, in installments of sweat and silence and bruised feet, every night, twice a night, right on schedule. Getting cast as a Las Vegas showgirl was not a matter of wandering into a casino and looking good under the lights, though you would be forgiven for assuming otherwise. Auditions were ruthless, systematic, and frankly a little baffling in their criteria. Height was non-negotiable. 5'8" was the floor, 5'10" was preferred, and anyone under that line was thanked for her time and shown back into the desert. Not because shorter women couldn't dance. Many of them could dance circles around the field, but because the costumes had been designed first, and the women were expected to fit the costumes. A detail that tells you everything you need to know about the industry's priorities. The audition notice would go out, sometimes in trade publications, sometimes through word of mouth in the dance communities of New York and Los Angeles, sometimes posted on a bulletin board at a dance studio with a casualness that seemed at odds with how much was riding on the outcome. Women came from everywhere, from Broadway chorus lines and regional theatre companies and college dance programs and small towns where they had been the best dancer anyone had ever seen, which was a credential that Las Vegas would test with some thoroughness. You showed up having prepared something, a routine, a combination, whatever the notice had specified. You wore what you hoped was the right thing, which was a calculation that involved looking professional without looking like you were trying too hard. A balance that was both culturally specific and never explicitly explained. You had done your hair. You had done your face. You had, if you were smart, eaten something before you came, because there was no predicting how long this would take. The choreographer or production director would watch you move. This was the part that no amount of preparation could entirely control. They were looking for something that training could sharpen but not create from nothing, a quality of presence, a way of inhabiting space that read across a large room. Could you fill a stage? Did the eye want to follow you? Were you, to use the industry's preferred and deeply unhelpful term, a showgirl? Some women had it immediately and unmistakably. Others had every technical qualification and simply did not have that particular thing, which was devastating in the specific way that being told you are almost right for something is always devastating. Then came the measurements. This was not metaphorical. A tape measure was involved. The production had existing costumes, extraordinary, expensive, irreplaceable costumes, and the woman hired was expected to fit them, not the other way around. Waist, hips, chest, inseam, all recorded with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone measuring for a sofa. Women who danced beautifully and carried themselves magnificently were turned away because a number was wrong by an inch. In a different direction and a different context, you are a different person's discovery. Here, you go home. And if you passed all of this, the height, the presence, the measurements, the smile that the panel was already watching even when they pretended not to be, you received the particular joy of being told to come back for callbacks, which meant doing it all again with fewer people and higher stakes. The audition process for a major Las Vegas production could take weeks. You were not paid for any of it. You were, the industry felt, auditioning for the opportunity to be paid, which was a different thing entirely. Those who made it through emerged into a contract that promised a beginning. What it did not promise, what nothing about the audition process had addressed at any point, was what happened after the beginning. That part, you were on your own. You have practiced for weeks. You have the right shoes, the right hair, the right smile, the particular kind of smile that says, "I am having the time of my life," while also conveying, "I have been doing this smile for 45 minutes, and my face is a crime scene." You walk into a fluorescent lit rehearsal room somewhere in the back corridors of a casino and find 40 other women who are also the right height, also wearing the right smile, also quietly calculating whether the woman to their left is a threat. The choreographer watches from a folding chair. He has seen thousands of auditions. He looks like a man who has stopped being surprised by anything, including your best routine. The fluorescent lighting in an audition room is its own form of psychological pressure. It is not flattering. It is not trying to be. It illuminates everything. The bags under your eyes from the overnight bus you took from Phoenix. The slight tremor in your left hand that only appears when you are nervous. The fact that the woman 3 spots down from you is an absolutely extraordinary mover, and you have been watching her warm up for the last 10 minutes with an expression of professional neutrality that is costing you significantly. The room smells of rosin and dry-cleaned leotards, and the low-grade anxiety of people who want something badly. You warm up in whatever space you can find, which is not much, because 40 women in a rehearsal room is 40 women in a rehearsal room, and personal space is a concept that does not survive contact with this particular geometry. You do your stretches, you run your combination in your head one more time, you tell yourself that you are ready, which is the kind of lie that the brain tells the body in moments of high stakes, and both of you know it is not entirely true, but you have agreed, the brain and the body, to proceed on this basis. They call you in groups. You stand in a line and you do the combination. The choreographer watches with an expression that gives nothing away. This is a professional skill on his part, and he has developed it over years of watching people need things from him. The panel makes notes. You do not know what the notes say. You will probably never know what the notes say. Some of the notes, you suspect, are about things that have nothing to do with how you danced. After the combination, there is sometimes an interview, a few questions asked with the casualness of people who are absolutely forming opinions based on your answers. What have you done before? Where are you from? Are you available to start rehearsals in 3 weeks? This last question is asked as if the correct answer is obvious, which it is. Yes, you are available. Whatever you were doing in 3 weeks is now something you are not doing. The waiting, after the audition, is its own country. You go back to wherever you are staying, a friend's couch, a cheap motel off the strip, an optimistic sublet, and you wait for a phone call that may or may not come. Las Vegas in the 1970s did not have a culture of closure. You were either called or you were not. The women who were not called sometimes auditioned again the following season and the season after that. Some eventually got through, some did not. The audition room did not keep records of the ones who kept trying. It just kept being fluorescent and indifferent and exactly the same. The Las Vegas showgirl costume of the 1970s was not clothing in any conventional sense. It was architecture. A full headdress, the kind that towered above your head in an explosion of ostrich feathers, rhinestones, and structural steel, could weigh anywhere from 15 to 35 pounds. That is not a hat. That is a small piece of furniture balanced on your skull. The body piece itself was a separate engineering challenge, a corset-adjacent frame of sequins, beading, and wire that was fitted to your exact measurements and then made slightly smaller because the designer believed you could breathe through willpower alone. The costumes for a major Las Vegas production were built by people who were genuinely brilliant at what they did. Costume designers like Bob Mackie, who dressed the showgirls and headliners at various strip productions, understood that the clothes had to be simultaneously structurally sound, visually spectacular from a distance of 200 feet, and survivable by a human body in motion for 2 hours. This is a harder brief than it sounds. A rhinestone that is glued correctly will stay put through a full production run. A rhinestone that is glued incorrectly becomes a projectile at precisely the wrong moment. The designers took this seriously. The showgirls who were on the receiving end of the rhinestones took it very seriously indeed. Each costume was custom built for a specific performer, which sounds luxurious until you understand the implication. If the costume was custom built for you, and you were expected to maintain the measurements that the costume was built for, then the costume was not really yours. The costume was a set of constraints you were being asked to inhabit permanently. Gaining 2 inches in the hips was not a personal matter. It was a production problem. The costume made this very clear, because the costume would not close, and the costume did not apologize for this. The backstage process of getting into the costume was a ritual that required assistance. You could not do it alone, not because you lacked the ability, but because the architecture of the thing made solo dressing physically impossible. Hooks and eyes placed at angles that no single pair of hands could reach. Structural elements that needed to be aligned and secured before the whole system would hold. A dresser, sometimes one, sometimes two, was assigned to help each performer get into the costume within the narrow window between makeup completion and stage call. This was a timed operation. There was no margin for error, no extra 5 minutes, no, let me just adjust this. You got in, you got secured, and you went. The headdress went on last, and this was the moment of commitment. Once the headdress was on and attached, a process involving pins, wire, and a relationship of trust between your neck muscles and physics, you were in the show whether you wanted to be or not. You could not sit, you could not lean, you could not tilt your head more than a few degrees in any direction without risking a 30-pound shift of momentum that would take the rest of your body with it. You walked carefully, you stood carefully, and you were careful in the particular way that people are careful when the consequences of carelessness are both immediate and extremely visible to 2,000 paying customers. After the show, the costume came off in the same assisted ritual in reverse, and it was returned, carefully, correctly, with all its rhinestones accounted for, to its designated hanger. The costume was an asset of the production. You were also an asset of the production. The distinction between these two categories was, at times, not entirely clear. You might assume that walking is something a person figures out in infancy and does not need to relearn at 23. You would be wrong. The showgirl walk was a specific, cultivated, deeply unnatural gait developed to solve the problem of moving forward while wearing a crown that, if tilted even slightly, would throw your center of gravity off by enough to turn a grand entrance into a full collapse situation. You kept your chin level, your neck long, your spine straight, and your hips rolling in a smooth, deliberate rhythm that made the whole thing look effortless. It was not effortless. It was geometry with heels. The walk was taught in rehearsal with an emphasis that might strike an outside observer as disproportionate to the act of moving from one point to another. But the choreographers understood something that took new cast members a few weeks of rehearsal to internalize. The walk was not locomotion. The walk was performance. The audience paid attention to it. The way a showgirl crossed a stage could make the entire production feel either magnificent or slightly awkward, and the difference between those two outcomes lived entirely in the execution of something that looked, from the outside, like simply walking. The heel height was standardized, typically 3 inches, sometimes more depending on the production's aesthetic requirements, and had been chosen in the same spirit as the headdress weight, which is to say with confidence that the women wearing them would adapt. 3 inches does not sound dramatic until you have been wearing them for 6 hours on a hard stage floor while also balancing the aforementioned furniture on your head. At that point, 3 inches has revealed itself to be an entire philosophy of suffering concentrated into a small area of cork and leather. New cast members practiced the walk without the headdress first, learning the carriage and the rhythm and the hip placement. Then they added the headdress, and everything they had just learned had to be relearned to account for the change in center of gravity. It was like learning to ride a bicycle and then being handed a bicycle with a large decorative boulder strapped to the handlebars and being told the route was the same. It was not the same. Your body knew it was not the same, but eventually, after enough repetition, something clicked, a kind of physical intelligence that stopped thinking about the headdress and simply accounted for it. The weight became known. The balance became automatic. And then, finally, the walk looked like what it was supposed to look like. Easy. What the audience saw from the front of house was a woman of extraordinary presence moving across a stage as though gravity were something that happened to other people. What was actually happening was a continuous set of micro-adjustments, weight distribution, posture correction, spatial awareness of other performers, costume management, all executed simultaneously. Silently, and with a smile that suggested none of this was in any way difficult. Showgirls who had been in productions for several years walked differently in their regular lives. The posture remained, the carriage stayed. Women who had spent years keeping their chins level under 30 pounds of feathers did not, it turned out, unlearn this. They carried themselves with a precision that was not arrogance and not affectation. It was the physical residue of a very specific and very demanding education, conducted 6 nights a week, twice a night, in heels. Before a single showgirl set foot on the stage of the Folies Bergère, or the Lido de Paris, or the Jubilee, the name of the production changed, but the physical demands did not. She had already survived a rehearsal period that would make a competitive athlete wince. Days began early, and ended whenever the choreographer was satisfied, which was often not early. You drilled the same 8-count sequence until it lived in your muscles rather than your brain, because on stage there was no time to think, only to execute, smile, and not drop the headdress on a front-row customer. Rehearsals for a new production or a significant cast change could run 6 to 8 weeks, 6 days a week, beginning around 10 in the morning and running until whenever the day's goals had been achieved. The goals were set by the production, not by the cast. There was no conversation about sustainable hours. There was a show, and the show had a standard, and the rehearsal period existed to bring the cast to that standard on a timeline determined by the opening date, which was non-negotiable because the opening date had already been advertised on billboards between here and the airport. The rehearsal room had mirrors, which were both useful and cruel in the way that mirrors in rehearsal rooms have always been both useful and cruel. You could see exactly what you were doing, which meant you could correct it, which was the point. You could also see exactly what you were doing at the moment when what you were doing was wrong, which was a different experience from knowing in the abstract that something needed work. The mirror made the work specific and personal and unavoidable. Some women found this useful. Some found it something else. The choreography itself was not simple. A major Las Vegas production in the 1970s was a full theatrical event with multiple production numbers, costume changes, staging that used every inch of a large stage, and spatial arrangements involving dozens of performers that had to be precise enough that 2 women in 35-pound headdresses could pass each other in a corridor of 4 feet without incident. Getting this to work required everyone to be exactly where they were supposed to be, moving exactly as they were supposed to move, at exactly the correct moment. Rehearsal was the process of making this possible. It was not a forgiving process. In the final weeks before opening, the rehearsal schedule expanded to include full production runs, the whole show, start to finish, in costume. This was when the theoretical met the practical, and the practical frequently had notes. A lighting cue that looked correct in isolation looked different when the cast was in full costume and the orchestra was playing. A spacing that worked in rehearsal clothes stopped working when the headdresses added 3 feet to everyone's vertical profile. Adjustments were made, sometimes at 11 o'clock at night, to be incorporated into the next day's run-through, which started at 10 in the morning. The math of this was not friendly. The math was not intended to be. And then, once the production opened, the rehearsal schedule did not end. It became maintenance, regular calls to refresh staging, incorporate new cast members when someone left, address notes from the production management. You were never, in the full sense of the word, done rehearsing. You were either rehearsing or performing, and the difference between those two states was primarily that one of them involved an audience. The dressing room backstage at a major Las Vegas production in the 1970s was one of the most chaotic and oddly intimate spaces in American entertainment. 20, 30, sometimes 40 women shared a long corridor of mirrors and vanity lights, each with approximately the square footage of a large suitcase to call their own. This space had to contain your street clothes, your costume, your makeup collection, which was closer to a chemistry lab than a beauty bag, your shoes for the show, your shoes for after the show, your personal belongings, your emotional resilience, and whatever you were eating for dinner because there was no time to go anywhere. The dressing room was where the show actually began, long before the curtain rose and the orchestra started. It was where the transformation happened, the daily process of converting a woman who had arrived in jeans and sunglasses from a parking lot in the Nevada desert into the immaculate, luminous creature the audience would see under the lights. This process was not mystical, it was labor. It required skill, supplies, and a relationship with your own reflection that was simultaneously intimate and entirely professional. Vanity Space was negotiated with the unspoken precision of people who understand that the alternative to a workable arrangement is daily low-grade misery. Senior cast members had the better positions, the spots with the most counter space, or the ones near the outlets, or the ones that were slightly further from the door in its drafts. New cast members took what was left and learned to make it work, which was a skill that translated well to the rest of the job. The dressing room was a hierarchy in miniature, and the hierarchy was enforced not through confrontation but through the well-established social mechanism of everyone simply knowing where they stood. The noise level during the pre-show hour was considerable. Music played from someone's portable radio, conversations overlapped, someone was having a problem with a zipper. Someone else was having a problem with an eyelash. A dresser moved quickly between stations, checking costumes, managing the invisible logistics of getting 40 women into complex garments on a precise schedule. The clock was always visible. Everyone was always watching the clock, while also pretending not to watch the clock, because watching the clock made the pre-show anxiety worse, and you needed to put that energy somewhere more productive, like the eyelashes. What happened in the dressing room also stayed in the dressing room, which was an unspoken compact that held with unusual consistency. The things said between women in that shared space, about the job, about the management, about the audience, about each other, about their lives outside the production, were said in a context of mutual understanding that did not travel. It was not loyalty exactly, or not only loyalty. It was the pragmatic understanding that the dressing room was the one space in the entire production where the performance could come down for an hour, and that this was necessary, and that protecting it required discretion. After the second show, when the makeup came off and the costume went back on its hanger, and the dressing room reassembled itself as a space for women who were tired in a very specific and bone-deep way, there was a different quality to the conversation. Quieter. The performance smile was gone. What remained was something more honest, the particular fellowship of people who had done the same hard thing together, again, and were about to go home and sleep and come back tomorrow and do it again. Stage makeup for a Las Vegas showgirl was not makeup in the sense that most people understood the word. It was a mask, deliberate, architectural, and applied with the same seriousness that a painter brings to a large canvas. The foundation was thick enough to survive sweat, spotlight heat, and the general chaos of existing under stage lights for 2-hour stretches. The eyelashes were false, stacked sometimes in doubles, and applied with a precision that took months to make look casual. The whole process took anywhere from 45 minutes to over an hour, performed every single night, and then reversed and cleaned off after the final curtain, often past midnight. The foundation was the first layer and the most important, because everything that came after was built on top of it, and what was built on top of it had to survive conditions that were genuinely hostile. Stage lights produced heat. The physical exertion of a 2-hour show produced sweat. The combination of heat and sweat, and the demands of continuous performance, meant that the makeup could not simply sit on the face. It had to be adhered to it with the conviction of something that intended to be there for the duration. This required products that were not, in their formulations, particularly comfortable to wear, but comfort was not the evaluation criterion. The eyes were the project. Under stage lights, the distance between performer and audience collapsed every subtle detail. Features flattened, expressions lost nuance. The face became a blur of skin and hair, unless it was drawn with sufficient boldness to read across the room. This meant eye makeup applied to a degree that would look, in any other context, like a theatrical choice made in a moment of creative confidence. In the dressing room mirror, it looked alarming. Under the lights, it looked correct. The gap between those two states was something you learned to trust over time, but in the first weeks it required a kind of faith that your own face, at close range, was not the relevant data point. The false eyelashes came in strips and were trimmed, curved, glued, positioned, and pressed with a finger until the adhesive set. Then, often, a second strip was added on top of the first. This was not a quick operation. It was the kind of work that required good light, a steady hand, and the patience of someone who had accepted that this was simply part of the job, a job that included, in addition to dancing and walking and smiling and carrying heavy things on your head, the daily construction and deconstruction of a face that belonged more to the production than to you. Women developed their own variations within the standard. The house makeup, the approved palette, the required application gave them a shared starting point. But over time, each performer found the small adjustments that worked for her particular face, her particular features, the specific way the lights hit her position on the stage. It became, over years, a second fluency, the ability to read a face the way a mechanic reads an engine, knowing exactly what was needed and where, and executing it in a compressed window of time while around you, the dressing room ran at full volume. Removing it at the end of the night was a process almost as involved as applying it. The false lashes came off first, cleaned and stored for reuse. The foundation required actual work to shift. Cold cream, cotton pads, patient repetition. Women in their mid-20s took off what looked like a decade of hard living every night at midnight and went home looking like themselves, which was, after years of this, a face that looked slightly unfamiliar in the bathroom mirror at 2 a.m. The mask was the work. The face underneath was the rest of it. Let's spend a moment on the headdress, because the headdress deserves its own chapter in the history of human stubbornness. The towering, feathered structures that became the iconic image of the Las Vegas showgirl were not designed with the wearer's comfort, spinal health, or long-term well-being in mind. They were designed to be visible from the back of a 2,000-seat theatre while also being the most memorable thing the audience had ever seen. These were competing priorities. The engineers, and yes, some of these creations required actual engineering, solved this by building them large, heavy, and attached to a harness system that distributed the weight across your shoulders, neck, and upper back, meaning you were not just wearing a headdress, you were being worn by one. The feathers themselves were ostrich plumes, sourced from farms and dyed in the production's colours, and they were spectacular, full, arching, moving with a quality that no synthetic material has ever successfully replicated, which is why the major productions continued to use them long after the cost made everyone in the production office quietly miserable. A single ostrich plume of show quality could cost more than a showgirl's daily wage. The headdress might contain dozens of them. The economics of this were not a secret, but they were also not something the feathers were expected to factor into their behavior on stage, where they swayed and bounced and caught the light in exactly the way the designer intended. The frame beneath the feathers was metal, lightweight where possible, sturdy where necessary, which created a set of competing requirements that the fabricators resolved differently on each individual piece. The rhinestones were applied by hand, each one set in its mount individually, which is information that tends to reframe the image of a showgirl costume, from glamorous excess to the result of someone's extremely patient Tuesday afternoon. The whole structure was then fitted to its wearer and adjusted until the attachment points were correctly placed for her specific proportions, because a headdress that sat wrong on the harness would not just be uncomfortable, it would be visibly wrong from the audience, and visibly wrong was not an acceptable condition. The first time a new cast member put on a full headdress for rehearsal was a significant moment, usually memorable for reasons that were only funny in retrospect. Nothing in your training prepared you for the physical reality of the weight. The description, 35 pounds, was intellectually comprehensible. The actual experience of 35 pounds balanced above your head while someone told you to walk normally across a rehearsal room was something else entirely. Most women's first instinct was to grab for it, which was wrong. The hands needed to be free and the balance needed to come from the neck and shoulders, not the hands. Unlearning the grab instinct took days. Over time, the headdress became known to the body in the way that any regular physical burden becomes known. The muscles that needed to be engaged developed. The gait adapted. The balance point became familiar. Women who had been wearing headdresses for 2 or 3 seasons moved in them with a fluidity that looked, from the front of house, as though the structure weighed nothing. This was the goal. This was always the goal. The 35 pounds was supposed to look like nothing, and because the women wearing them were excellent at their jobs, it usually did. What the audience never considered, because it was not their job to consider it, and the production had gone to considerable lengths to prevent them from considering it, was what 35 pounds does to a neck and upper back over a career of 2 shows a night. The chiropractors who worked near the Strip in the 1970s had, among their patient population, a consistent source of referrals. The headdress was beautiful. It was also, over time, a commitment. When the curtain rose and the orchestra swelled and the lights hit the stage, something genuinely extraordinary happened. The women who had spent all day in fluorescent rehearsal rooms, all evening in chaotic dressing rooms, and all their adult lives developing the specific muscle memory required to walk in a straight line under 30 pounds of feathers, they became something else entirely. The spectacle was real. The Stardust, the Tropicana, the MGM Grand. These shows were massive, intricate productions with live orchestras, dozens of cast members, elaborate sets, and production values that rivaled anything on Broadway. The Showgirls were the heartbeat of it all. The live orchestra was not incidental. It was the difference between a production and an event. The musicians, horn players, string players, percussionists, all in the orchestra pit night after night, produced a sound that filled a room in a way that a recorded track never could. A sound with physical presence and immediate responsiveness that changed the quality of every performance it accompanied. When the music swelled for the opening number, and 40 women in extraordinary costumes descended a staircase that cost more than a small house, the combination of live sound and live spectacle produced something that audiences in 1973 described in their letters home with an enthusiasm that reads, today, as entirely credible. The staging was its own engineering achievement. A major production used the full depth of a large stage, incorporated hydraulic lifts and moving set pieces, managed the logistics of dozens of performers in elaborate costumes, moving through a space with the precision required to make it look spontaneous and effortless. Scene changes happened in the dark at a speed that required the backstage crew to move with the coordinated efficiency of people who had done this 400 times, which they had. What the audience experienced as a seamless transition from one spectacular set piece to the next was, behind the curtain, controlled chaos, executed with extraordinary competence. The Showgirls appeared throughout the production in a series of numbers, sometimes moving, sometimes posed in living tableau, the stillness of the pose requiring a different kind of physical discipline than the movement numbers, but no less demanding. Standing perfectly still in a heavy costume under hot lights for the duration of a musical number, maintaining both the pose and the expression without visible effort, was a skill that looked like the absence of skill, which was the point. The best theatrical performances are the ones that look like no performance is happening, and the Las Vegas Showgirl was a masterclass in this particular illusion. What the audience in those showrooms received was 2 hours of sustained spectacle, comedy, dance, music, the headliner act in the middle, and framing it all, the Showgirls. Present in almost every number in one form or another, the visual constant around which the rest of the production organized itself. For many of the people sitting in those rooms, it was the most opulent entertainment they had ever experienced. They applauded at the end with the particular energy of people who had gotten more than they expected, which was a feeling the production had been deliberately engineered to produce. The performers walked off stage after the final curtain in a state of physical depletion that the sustained applause never quite addressed. The adrenaline of performance metabolized quickly. What was left, backstage, was the weight of the costume and the specific tiredness of bodies that had been working since early morning. They had 1 hour before the second show. The dressing room waited. The clock was already running. Most major Las Vegas productions in the 1970s ran 2 shows a night, a dinner show around 8 o'clock and a cocktail show closer to midnight. This meant that the work you had already done once, you were now going to do again, with the same energy, the same smile, and the same structural integrity of headdress attachment, except that your body had now been awake for approximately 17 hours, and your feet had filed a formal complaint with your brain. There was no understudy waiting in the wings for a showgirl who was a little tired. You were the show. You went on. The hour between shows was not a rest period in any meaningful sense. It was a logistics operation. The costume came off, assisted, carefully, with attention to the rhinestones, and the body beneath it was briefly, blissfully free, which lasted approximately 4 minutes before the dressers began preparing for the second show. Makeup was touched up rather than removed and reapplied, because there was not enough time for the full process, and because the makeup had, by this point, bonded with the skin in ways that suggested it had decided to stay permanently. You ate something if you had thought to bring something, which you had learned to do after the first week. You drank water, you sat down, which your feet received as a personal act of mercy. The audience for the midnight show was different from the dinner show crowd in ways that were immediately perceptible from the stage. The dinner show attracted couples celebrating anniversaries, conventioneers on their first night in town, families who had driven in from the suburbs of Los Angeles with a sense of occasion. They were dressed up. They had ordered the steak. They were prepared to be impressed, and genuinely were. The midnight show attracted people who had been in the casino since 4 in the afternoon and had formed strong opinions about a number of things, not all of them accurate. They were louder, they were less predictable. They were, on their best nights, a genuinely electric audience, and on their worst nights, a social experiment conducted under showroom lighting. The performers adapted. A good performer reads the room, and showgirls who had been doing 2 shows a night for 2 or 3 seasons had developed a finely calibrated sense of what each audience needed and how to give it to them. The midnight show sometimes had an energy that the dinner show, for all its polish, could not produce, a looseness, a responsiveness, a sense that something unscripted might happen at any moment. This was occasionally true. The stories that circulated backstage about midnight show audiences were numerous, specific, and not entirely repeatable. But none of this changed the fundamental arithmetic. 2 shows meant your body was doing everything twice. The knees absorbed the stage impact twice. The neck carried the headdress weight twice. The feet spent twice as long in the heels. The smile was held for twice as many hours. Professionals in almost every other field have a concept of overtime, additional compensation for work performed beyond the standard expectation. In the Las Vegas showgirl world of the 1970s, 2 shows a night was simply the job description. There was no additional compensation framing it as exceptional. It was exceptional. No one said so. After the midnight show, the full removal process, costume, makeup, the careful deflation of the entire constructed persona, happened in a dressing room that was quieter now. The earlier energy spent. Women changed into their street clothes and walked out into a Las Vegas night that was still, impossibly going strong. The city had not noticed that they were tired. The city was never tired. You drove home or took a cab or walked if you lived close enough, and you set an alarm for the next morning, and you did it again tomorrow. The question of what Las Vegas showgirls ate in the 1970s is both more complicated and more depressing than the glamour image might suggest. The short answer is not enough, and under pressure. The industry's expectations about the female body were precise, unforgiving, and enforced with a regularity that would today be considered deeply problematic. Showgirls were weighed, sometimes weekly, sometimes more often, and deviations from the required measurements were addressed with the kind of directness that left very little room for nuance. The message was consistent. The costume fits a specific body, and the specific body was your problem to maintain. The weigh-ins were conducted by the wardrobe department, which tells you something about the framing. This was not health management, it was inventory management. The costume was the fixed point. The body was the variable. If the variable drifted outside acceptable tolerances, the production would be notified, and the production would have a conversation with you that was phrased as concern but functioned as a warning. A second conversation followed a similar format, and a third conversation was often the last one. The economics were not subtle. In this environment, the relationship that many showgirls developed with food was complicated in ways that the industry neither acknowledged nor addressed. Eating enough to sustain a body doing 2 physically demanding shows a night, while simultaneously keeping that body within a quarter inch of its audition measurements, required a precision that was frankly incompatible with having a normal human life. Some women managed it through genuine discipline and some luck with their metabolisms. Others cycled through periods of restriction that left them lightheaded in the second act and privately miserable in the dressing room. Nobody talked about this openly, because talking about it openly implied that the system producing it was wrong and the system was not interested in that conversation. What was actually consumed, in practical terms, was assembled in the hour between shows or grabbed during rehearsal breaks, small, portable things that could be eaten quickly in a dressing room without disturbing the makeup situation, crackers, fruit, whatever fit in a bag, and could be consumed standing up with one eye on the clock. The casino restaurants were available but not always accessible within the available window, and a full meal before the second show presented its own complications when the costume required you to be a specific diameter at the waist. The irony was significant. These women were performing physical work that required genuine caloric support, the kind of sustained exertion that, in an athlete, would prompt careful nutritional planning and a support staff. Instead, they were navigating an environment that simultaneously demanded physical excellence and penalized them for the eating that physical excellence required. Modern sports science would have a great deal to say about this. Modern sports science was not invited to the production meetings in 1974. Women who left the industry often described the experience of eating normally again as one of the more significant adjustments of the transition. The surveillance was gone. The measurements were no longer anyone's professional concern. The body, which had been managed as a production asset for years, was suddenly just a body again, belonging to the person living in it rather than to the show being built around it. Some found this liberation straightforward. Others carried the complicated relationship with food well beyond the dressing room and the heels and the headdress, because some things, once learned under pressure, take considerable time to unlearn. If you wanted to understand the true cost of being a Las Vegas showgirl in the 1970s, you did not look at the headdresses, or the rhinestones, or the dressing rooms. You looked at the feet. The feet told the whole story. Hours on stage in heels, not modern, ergonomically considered heels, but the heels of the 1970s, which were designed purely for appearance and operated with complete indifference to the structural needs of the human foot, combined with the weight of the costume, the hard floors of the stage, and the sheer repetition of the schedule, produced feet that were a landscape of blisters, calluses, bunions, and something that podiatrists would later describe as impressive damage. The stage floor was not soft. It was a hard surface, often wood over concrete, and it absorbed nothing. Every step transferred its full impact directly upward through the heel and into the ankle, knee, and hip. In regular shoes, on a forgiving surface, this is the kind of thing a body manages without complaint. In 3-inch heels, carrying a 35-pound headdress, on a hard stage, twice a night, the math becomes a different conversation. The body was managing loads it was not designed to manage, on a schedule it was not designed to maintain, in footwear that was not designed for any of this. Blisters were the entry-level complaint, present from the first week of rehearsal, addressed with moleskin and athletic tape, and a practical resignation that they were simply the current condition of your feet, and would be addressed at some unspecified later point. Calluses developed over them, which was the body's attempt to solve the problem through architecture, creating a protective layer that was genuinely useful and also, in its own way, a record of accumulated damage. Bunions arrived more gradually, the slow drift of bone under repeated pressure, the joint at the base of the big toe migrating outward over months and years until it became visible, then uncomfortable, then a structural feature of the foot that no amount of correct footwear in the off hours would fully reverse. Women taped their feet before every show with the systematic thoroughness of athletes preparing for competition, because that is exactly what it was. The taping was functional, not decorative, specific joints supported, specific friction points covered, a ritual that became as automatic as putting on the eyelashes. You did it without thinking about it because you had done it enough times that thinking about it was no longer necessary, and also because thinking about it led to thinking about what the feet looked like under the tape, which was not a productive direction before a show. The shoes themselves were replaced with some regularity, because a shoe that had been worn through enough performances developed a compression and a breakdown of structure that stopped providing even the minimal support it had originally offered. New shoes were better in theory and worse in practice for the first week. When they had not yet been broken in and expressed their newness through the production of fresh blisters in locations, the old shoes had long since hardened over. There was no winning phase of the shoe cycle. There was only the less bad phase and the actively problematic phase, and experienced showgirls managed the transition between them with the grim expertise of people who had run this calculation many times. What the feet looked like at the end of a career was something the promotional photographs never showed. The image that Las Vegas sold was of an effortless, elegant woman in beautiful shoes doing something that looked like floating. The reality, at close range and after hours, was a detailed record of every show she had ever done, written in the one place the audience never saw. Working as a showgirl at one of the major Las Vegas hotels came with a set of rules that would strike a modern observer as somewhere between strict and legally questionable. You did not fraternize with the audience. You did not date casino staff, or at least you were not supposed to, though enforcement of this particular rule was inconsistent in ways that said a great deal about who the rules were designed to protect. You did not discuss your salary with other cast members. You showed up on time. You maintained your measurements. You kept the costume in good condition. You smiled. The rules were less about your safety than about the product you represented, and the product was a very specific image that the casino had invested considerable money in maintaining. The no fraternization rule was applied with a selectivity that was, in retrospect, instructive. A showgirl seen in conversation with an audience member after the show might receive a quiet reminder about professional distance. A producer seen in the same conversation received no reminder at all. The rule existed to protect the image of the showgirl as something aspirational and untouchable. You could look. The casino's entire business model depended on looking, but you could not have, and the showgirl was not to make herself available to be had, because available was not the image being sold. Aspirational was the image being sold. The distinction was enforced downward. The salary conversation was forbidden with an explicitness that suggested the management understood exactly what would happen if the women compared notes. What would happen, of course, was that they would discover the inconsistencies, the differentials that reflected not the quality of the work, but the negotiating confidence of the individual, or her relationship with the production director, or simply the arbitrary decisions of whoever had been doing the hiring that season. Knowledge was leverage, and the rule against sharing it was a rule designed to keep the leverage on one side of the table. It worked, largely, because the women who violated it and shared information anyway were taking a professional risk that most could not afford. The appearance rules extended beyond the measurements. Hair had to be maintained to a standard, the right length, the right condition, the right color, in some productions that had a specific visual palette for their cast. Nails, skin, the general presentation of the person when she arrived for work, all of it was subject to the production's definition of acceptable. Women were sent home to fix things that fell outside the standard, which meant arriving at work with sufficient runway to make corrections without being late, which meant arriving earlier than call time, which was not compensated. What is striking, from a distance of 50 years, is how thoroughly these rules were accepted, not because the women who lived under them lacked intelligence or perspective, but because the rules were embedded in a structure that presented them as simply how the industry worked. This is how it is done here. This is what professional means in this context. Questioning the rules was possible in theory and professionally dangerous in practice, and professional danger in a career that was already precarious was a cost. Most women were not in a position to absorb. So the rules held, mostly, because the cost of breaking them fell entirely on the people they governed. Las Vegas in the 1970s was not yet the corporate entertainment campus it would later become. It was still a city where the casinos had interesting ownership structures that everyone understood and no one discussed too directly. The entertainment industry that the Showgirls worked in sat right at the intersection of glamour and something considerably shadier. The men who ran the hotels, who hired the choreographers, approved the costumes, set the salaries, and decided who got cast, operated in an environment where the normal rules of American business applied unevenly, and the women who worked for them often had very little recourse when those rules worked against them. The Stardust was operated for years with the involvement of figures whose relationship to organized crime was well documented in federal investigations and significantly less documented in the conversations that happened in hotel corridors. The Tropicana, the Fremont, the Sands, the histories of these properties, when eventually examined by congressional committees and law enforcement agencies, revealed financial arrangements of considerable creativity. The men at the top of these organizations were not, in the main, people who responded well to complaints filed through official channels, because official channels were, from their perspective, the opposition. Into this environment came the Showgirls, who were employees in a legal sense, and in every other sense were people with very limited power, navigating a structure built by and for men who were accustomed to things going their way. The protections that existed in theory, union contracts, labor law, the basic framework of employment rights, existed in practice in the attenuated form that all worker protections take when the employer has both significant resources and a casual relationship with regulation. A showgirl with a legitimate grievance about her working conditions was a showgirl who needed to calculate very carefully what pursuing that grievance would cost her. This did not mean the women were passive, many were not, but the tools available for pushing back were limited, and the consequences of using them too publicly were real. Women who developed reputations as difficult, the industry word for a person who asked reasonable questions about unreasonable conditions, found that the word traveled. Las Vegas in the 1970s was a small world behind the neon. The people who hired dancers knew each other. A name that carried the wrong association could close more doors than it opened. The proximity to serious organized crime also produced a specific social landscape backstage that was, depending on your perspective and your particular situation, either colorful or alarming. Men with connections to the casino's less documented operations occasionally appeared in contexts they had no professional reason to be in dressing room corridors, at the stage door, in the conversations of production staff who seemed to know them. The women who worked in these environments developed a calibrated sense of which situations required careful navigation, and they navigated them, because the alternative was not performing, and the show was still the show. What the showgirls of this era understood, often without articulating it directly, was that the glamour and the shadow were the same thing, two faces of an industry that had been built fast, by people with unconventional methods, in a city that had been designed from the beginning to operate by its own rules. You worked in it, or you did not work in it. Most of them worked in it, and they did so with the specific kind of clear-eyed pragmatism that comes from being talented, ambitious, and realistic about the landscape in which your talent is operating. The salary of a Las Vegas showgirl in the 1970s was not commensurate with the spectacle she produced. The women who appeared in the most photographed, most iconic entertainment product that the city had to offer were paid wages that, when divided by the actual hours worked, including rehearsals, costume fittings, mandatory appearances, and the 2 shows a night schedule, landed somewhere between modest and insulting. There were no residuals. There was no back-end deal. There was a weekly paycheck, union minimums for those covered by the union, and the understanding that the headdress was the hotel's property. AGVA, the American Guild of Variety Artists, represented performers in many of the major productions, and union minimums provided a floor below which the hotels were not supposed to go. In the 1970s, this floor was somewhere in the range of $200 to $300 a week for a showgirl in a featured production, which was a livable wage in 1972, Las Vegas if you were careful, and a tight one if you were not, and an outright inadequate one when measured against the actual hours being worked. The union minimum was also, in practice, frequently the ceiling, not because the contracts prohibited higher pay, but because the culture of the industry did not encourage negotiation, and the women who attempted it were often reminded, implicitly or explicitly, that there were 40 other women who had auditioned for their spot. The hours that went uncompensated were numerous. Rehearsals for a new production could run 6 to 8 weeks before the opening, and the weekly minimum did not always cover this period at the same rate as the performance contract. Mandatory promotional appearances, the photo shoots, the casino floor appearances, the meet-and-greet events for high rollers that the hotel organized under the general heading of part of your professional responsibilities happened on days that were technically days off and were compensated either minimally or not at all. The costume fittings, the wig appointments, the regular maintenance that keeping the visual standard required, on your own time, on your own dime. The economics of living in Las Vegas on a showgirl's salary required management. Women shared apartments, 2 or 3 to a unit off the strip, in the residential neighborhoods that existed in the gaps between the casinos and the highway. They cooked at home when the schedule permitted, which was not always. They were careful with the things that cost money and creative about the things that did not. This was not unusual for people early in performance careers. The financial precariousness of creative work was a known condition and not specific to Las Vegas. What was specific to Las Vegas was the gap between the image being projected of opulence, abundance, a city where everything was excessive, and the reality of the people producing that image, counting their grocery money in a 1-bedroom apartment on a Tuesday afternoon before the Tuesday evening show. Some women supplemented their income through additional work, teaching dance classes, doing session work, taking jobs in the other productions that ran on the strip. The schedule made this difficult, but not impossible for those determined enough to make it work. Others had partners or families who contributed to household costs. A few negotiated better deals than the standard, either because they had leverage the production wanted or because they had the particular combination of confidence and information that productive negotiation requires. Most did not have that combination, partly by circumstance and partly by design, because the rule against discussing salaries was specifically a rule against acquiring the information that negotiation requires. The paycheck arrived weekly, was cashed, and was gone by the following weekend, which was not a moral failing, but a mathematical inevitability. And then Monday arrived, and the alarm went off at 5:30, and you went back to the job that was paying you less than it should have and demanding more than it acknowledged. And you did it because the stage was real and the spectacle was real, and some things are worth more than the paycheck, right up until they are not. Any space containing 40 competitive women, a narrow hierarchy, and a limited number of featured positions is going to develop its own internal politics, and the backstage world of a Las Vegas showgirl production was no exception. There were the featured dancers who had lines, sometimes just one, sometimes several, and the showgirls proper, who moved and posed and did not speak. There were the women who had been there 5 years and quietly ran the room, and the ones who had just arrived from the dance programs in New York or Los Angeles, and had not yet learned that the rules here were different. Alliances formed, rivalries simmered, and the dressing room mirror reflected a world that was simultaneously supportive and relentlessly competitive. The hierarchy was visible in the physical organization of the dressing room, in the staging of the production, in the small daily transactions of who helped whom with what, and who was helped in return. Featured positions, the spots closer to center stage, the numbers with more movement, the moments the audience's eye was directed toward, were coveted, and the competition for them was real, even when it was conducted with the social decorum of people who had to share a mirror every night for the foreseeable future. Seniority carried weight that was not written into any contract, but was enforced by social consensus with considerable efficiency. A woman who had been in the production for 4 seasons occupied a different position in the room than one who had been there for 4 months, and this difference manifested in small ways in who deferred to whom on questions of staging, in whose opinion carried weight in the collective calculations of how to handle a production decision, in the unspoken allocation of the better dressing room positions. New arrivals learned the hierarchy quickly, because the alternative was learning it slowly, and the slow version involved more friction. This did not mean the environment was uniformly hostile. The better documented reality of backstage communities in demanding productions is a complicated mix of genuine solidarity and genuine competition, often existing simultaneously in the same relationships. The women who had been there the longest often took a genuine interest in helping newer cast members survive the learning curve, not out of pure altruism, but because a production where the newer members were struggling was a harder production to be in for everyone, and there was a shared interest in the whole thing working well. Help was extended with the practical generosity of people who had been in the same position and remembered what it cost. But beneath the solidarity ran a current of awareness that was never entirely absent, that there were a finite number of positions and an ongoing supply of talented women who wanted them. A cast member who left by choice, by injury, by the production's decision, created an opening, and openings were noticed. The women who watched each other perform every night developed precise assessments of each other's abilities because they had no choice but to develop them. You cannot share a stage with someone every night without forming an opinion about her work, and those opinions, while rarely voiced directly, shaped the social architecture of the space. What emerged, over time, in the productions that ran long enough to develop a stable core cast was something genuinely communal, a group of women who had been through the same difficult thing together long enough that the shared history outweighed the competition. The politics never disappeared. They just got incorporated into a larger fabric of mutual reliance and collective memory. By the second year, you knew each other's tells, each other's injuries, each other's bad nights and good nights. You went on anyway. That counted for something. There was, in the strict hierarchy of the Las Vegas stage, a distinction that mattered enormously to the people inside the industry and was completely invisible to everyone watching from the audience: the difference between a showgirl and a featured dancer. The showgirl was the visual spectacle, tall, magnificent, largely stationary in the traditional sense, her movement elegant but constrained by the weight of the costume. The featured dancer was the one who actually danced, in the technical, athletic, everything your body is capable of sense of the word. Both roles were demanding in ways the other was not, and both groups had strong opinions about which was harder, a debate that apparently continues to this day. The showgirl's case rested on the costume. You try standing perfectly still under 35 pounds of headdress and feathers for the duration of a production number, while maintaining an expression of serene, effortless joy, and then tell me that is not athleticism. The balance required was genuine and sustained. The physical management of the costume demanded a specific kind of strength, not the explosive power of a dancer executing a lift, but the quiet, relentless muscular engagement of a person holding a difficult position for an extended period, on heels, under lights, while smiling. Endurance athletes would recognize this. The audience would not, because endurance looks, by design, like ease. The featured dancer's case rested on the movement. She was the one executing the actual vocabulary of dance, turns, jumps, extensions, partnering work, the technically demanding sequences that required years of training and daily maintenance to perform at the level the production required. She was doing this in costumes that, while less architectural than the showgirl's headdress, were still not designed with athletic performance as the primary consideration, and on a schedule that gave her body no meaningful recovery time between shows. The featured dancer burned through physical currency at a rate that made a career in the role a counted thing, a finite number of performances before the accumulation of stress and the slow decline of the body's willingness to cooperate began to affect the work. The two groups coexisted in the same dressing room, performed in the same production, took their bows at the same curtain call, and were paid on a scale that reflected the production's assessment of their relative value, an assessment that did not always align with the complexity of either role. This was a source of ongoing, low-grade friction that occasionally surfaced into direct conversation and more often remained in the space between what was said and what was meant. What both groups shared, beneath the professional distinctions and the dressing room politics, was the fundamental experience of the job. The early mornings, the two shows, the measurements, the rules, the feat, the particular exhaustion of maintaining a performance standard night after night in conditions that were not designed for long-term sustainability. The featured dancer and the showgirl looked different from the front of house. From backstage, they were the same woman in different shoes, talented, undervalued, working harder than the paycheck reflected, and showing up the next morning to do it again because the stage, when everything else was accounted for, was still the stage. One of the least discussed and most physically exhausting aspects of being a Las Vegas showgirl was the smile. Not a smile you gave when something was funny, or the polite smile you offered a stranger in an elevator. This was the performance smile, fixed, luminous, and required to remain in place for the entire duration of the show regardless of what was happening to your body, your feet, your headdress, your emotional state, or the fact that the woman next to you had just stepped on your train for the third time. The smile was part of the costume. Dropping it was not permitted. The mechanics of a sustained performance smile are worth considering in detail because they are not the mechanics of a natural smile, and your face knows the difference. A natural smile engages particular muscles in a particular way for a particular duration and then releases. The performance smile asks those muscles to engage and to stay engaged continuously for 2 hours, twice a night, under hot lights, while the rest of the body is simultaneously managing the headdress and the heels and the choreography and the awareness of the audience and the memory of the staging. The face, in this context, is running a background process that never closes. By the end of a show, the muscles involved had done significant work, and they communicated this in the way muscles communicate significant work, which is to say, ache. The training for the smile happened in rehearsal, alongside the training for everything else, and the choreographer's attention to it was serious. A dropped smile in a production number could undermine the visual effect of an entire sequence. One face not doing the work dragged the whole tableau down in a way that the audience registered as an impression rather than a specific observation. Something is slightly off, they might think, without being able to identify what. The choreographer could identify it. The choreographer always identified it. There were notes. This meant that the performance smile had to be genuine enough to read as genuine while being produced under conditions that had nothing genuine about them. It was the theatrical challenge in its most concentrated form, manufacturing authentic-looking joy as a physical discipline, on command, consistently, regardless of the interior conditions. Women who were in pain smiled. Women who were exhausted smiled. Women who had received difficult personal news that day and had come to work anyway because you came to work anyway smiled. The audience, looking up at the stage and receiving the smile as information about the experience of the performer, concluded that showgirls loved their work and were having a wonderful time. Some of them were. Some of them were running a continuous, invisible override of their actual experience in the interest of the production's visual requirements. What this produced, over a career, was a very specific and very strange relationship with the face in the mirror. You learn to perform your own expressions. You learn to produce, on demand, the version of your face that the job required. And this skill, like the walk, like the balance under the headdress, did not simply switch off when the curtain came down. Women who had spent years in production described the performance smile as something they sometimes found themselves wearing in ordinary life, deployed by reflex in situations that did not require it. The face getting ahead of the feeling and presenting the managed version before the authentic one had a chance to arrive. It was not dishonesty. It was the residue of a very specific and very long education in the distance between how you felt and what you showed. When the curtain came down after the midnight show and the makeup came off and the headdress went back on its stand, the showgirls of Las Vegas walked out into a city that was not particularly well designed for people who needed to be somewhere quiet and asleep by 2 in the morning. Las Vegas in the 1970s did not slow down at midnight. It accelerated. The casinos were at peak volume. The restaurants were full. The streets were loud with the sounds of a city that had organized its entire identity around the idea that stopping was for somewhere else. The showgirls, who had been awake since before most people's workday began, navigated this environment on bruised feet and borrowed energy. The residential Las Vegas that the showgirls lived in was a different city from the Strip, quieter, more ordinary, consisting of apartment complexes and small houses in neighborhoods that were not on any tourist map. Women who had come from New York or Chicago found the residential landscape of Las Vegas flat and sun-bleached, and a little disorienting. A grid of streets that looked the same in every direction, with a glow on the horizon that was the Strip, always visible, always reminding you of the job regardless of how far you drove from it. You could not fully leave. The city did not allow for full leaving. You could only be off shift. The social life of a Las Vegas showgirl in the 1970s was constrained by the schedule in ways that made ordinary friendship maintenance difficult. Your working hours were everyone else's leisure hours. The friends you made tended to be people whose lives were organized around the same unusual clock. Other performers, musicians, casino workers, the small community of people who lived on the inverted schedule that the entertainment industry required. Relationships with people who worked regular hours required a constant negotiation of availability that eventually wore most of them down. The city itself had limited offerings for people who were off at 2 in the morning and needed to be back by 10. The casinos were always open, which was both convenient and a professional hazard in ways that the 1970s did not yet have the vocabulary to fully describe. A showgirl who spent her off hours at the gaming tables of the casino where she performed occupied an awkward position that her employers were not always consistent about addressing. Some hotels discouraged it. Others were indifferent. None of them examined it with the concern for employee well-being that the situation perhaps warranted. What the women who stayed in Las Vegas long-term built, over time, was a life that was specific to the place and the schedule, a community of people who understood the hours and the demands, who could talk about the job with the fluency of shared experience, who met for late dinners at the restaurants that stayed open for the post-show crowd and knew each other's histories. It was a real life, fully inhabited, if somewhat invisible to the tourism infrastructure that surrounded it. Las Vegas sold a fantasy to its visitors and housed, in its residential neighborhoods and its late-night diners and its parking lots behind the showrooms, the people who produced the fantasy, living ordinary lives in extraordinary circumstances, sleeping when the city was loudest and working when the rest of the world was watching television. Las Vegas showgirls in the 1970s were among the most photographed women in America, which sounds glamorous until you consider the conditions under which most of those photographs were taken. Promotional shoots happened on days off, which were already rare, often in the midday desert sun, in full costume, including the headdress, smiling with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this for years, which they had. The photographs appeared in brochures, on billboards, in magazines. The women in them were not credited by name. They were the show, the city's brand, a collective image rather than an individual one. The promotional photograph was a specific genre with its own requirements, and those requirements had almost nothing to do with the reality of the woman being photographed. The image needed to convey effortlessness, the particular quality that Las Vegas was selling, the idea that the spectacle happened naturally, that the woman in the headdress existed in this state as a matter of course, and not as the result of weeks of rehearsal and daily physical management. The photographer's job was to capture this fiction convincingly, and the showgirl's job, in front of the camera, was to produce it. She had already been doing this for audiences of 2,000. A camera was a smaller audience, which should have been easier. It was not always easier, because the camera was closer. The shoots happened in the desert, because the desert was available and dramatic and free, which were three qualities that 1970s Las Vegas promotional budgets found appealing. You stood on the sand in full performance costume while the photographer positioned his equipment, and the sun did what the Nevada sun does in the middle of the day, which is to say, it committed. The headdress caught the wind, which was a variable that no amount of planning fully addressed. A gust at the wrong angle could tilt 35 pounds of feathers off its carefully maintained axis with an efficiency that the laws of physics found entirely reasonable. The women braced and compensated, and kept the smile in place. The photographer kept shooting. The issue of image rights was not something that the showgirls of the 1970s had the legal infrastructure to address, and the industry did not volunteer to create that infrastructure on their behalf. The photographs taken during promotional shoots became property of the production, or the hotel, to be used in advertising materials, distributed to press, licensed to publications, reproduced on merchandise. The women in the photographs received no additional compensation for this use, and no credit in the materials where the photographs appeared. A showgirl's face might appear on a billboard visible from the freeway for 3 years after she had left the production. She would drive past it on her way to her next job and see herself, younger, feathered, smiling, belonging permanently to the version of Las Vegas that the billboard was selling. The editorial shoots were slightly different. Magazine features, the occasional newspaper profile of a production, the kind of coverage that required a journalist and a photographer to show up backstage and document the world that the audience never saw. These pieces almost always told the same story, because the same story was what the publications wanted and what the productions were willing to make available. The transformation narrative, the extraordinary life, the glamour of it all. The women being photographed had more complicated stories to tell. Most of the time, no one asked for the complicated version, and the women, who understood the industry's preference for the simpler one, provided what was requested. The complicated version was backstage, where it had always lived, illuminated by vanity lights and kept between the people who were actually there. The physical demands of the job were significant enough that injury was not a possibility, it was a schedule item. Knees gave out, backs went. The feet, which we have already discussed at length, developed problems that required what the 1970s understood as medical attention, and what we would now recognize as inadequate care for the level of damage being done. Showgirls performed through pain with a regularity that spoke less to their personal toughness, though they were genuinely tough, and more to an industry that had decided the show's continuity was more important than the individual bodies making it happen. A showgirl who mentioned an injury was a showgirl who might be replaced. Many chose not to mention the injury. The knees were the most common significant casualty. The combination of hard stage floors, heeled shoes, the added weight of the costume, and the repetitive impact of a schedule that never built in genuine recovery time created conditions that were, from the perspective of cartilage and connective tissue, unreasonable. The knees registered this unreasonableness gradually at first. A soreness after the second show that resolved by morning. Then a soreness that required the morning and most of the afternoon to resolve. Then a soreness that was simply present, the new baseline from which the rest of the workday was measured. Women wrapped their knees in the dressing room with the same systematic attention they gave their feet, adding support that compensated for the structural integrity that the schedule was slowly withdrawing. The back situation was related to the headdress, and was predictable in retrospect in the way that all damage caused by sustained unreasonable loading is predictable in retrospect. The cervical spine and the muscles of the upper back were not designed to support 35 additional pounds above the head on a daily basis over a period of years, and they communicated this design limitation through the precise vocabulary of chronic pain, muscle spasms in the trapezius, tension that migrated from the neck into the shoulders, and refused to be addressed by anything short of a level of rest that the schedule did not permit. Women who had performed for 5 or more seasons carried this in their bodies in ways that a trained eye could see, a particular set of the shoulders, a way of moving the neck, a habitual compensation that had become structural. The medical resources available to showgirls in the 1970s were whatever they could access on their own time and their own budget, which is to say, variable. There was no production physician, no staff athletic trainer, no systematic approach to the management of occupational injury in a physically demanding performance role. There was the house doctor, who was a hotel amenity rather than a performance medicine specialist, and whose understanding of what 2 shows a night in a headdress did to a body was limited to what the showgirls in his waiting room chose to tell him. He prescribed what the 1970s prescribed: rest, which was unavailable, anti-inflammatories, which helped at the margins, and occasionally more specific interventions that addressed the symptom without touching the conditions producing it. What the showgirls developed, in the absence of institutional support, was a collective body of informal knowledge, passed between cast members in the dressing room and rehearsal room and the late-night diner on Flamingo Road, about what worked and what helped and what to do when a particular thing stopped functioning correctly. This woman knows a good chiropractor. That one has a taping technique for the knee that actually makes a difference. This is the stretch that addresses the specific back problem that the headdress causes if you do it every morning before rehearsal. The industry did not provide this knowledge. The women built it themselves from experience and necessity, and shared it with each other because sharing it was the only support system available. Las Vegas in the 1970s had a very specific relationship with female age, which is to say, it did not like it, and it was not quiet about this. The showgirl, as a type, was young. The industry wanted her young and intended to replace her when she stopped being young, where young was defined less by any specific number and more by whether the measurements still matched the costume and whether the smile still looked like it cost nothing. Women who had spent years building careers in the production, learning the intricate staging, training newer cast members, becoming genuinely excellent at a genuinely difficult job, found that none of this accumulated expertise was enough to outweigh the industry's preference for someone newer. The cutoff was not announced. It was not written into the contract. It manifested instead as a series of small signals that a woman who had been in the industry long enough learned to read with the accuracy of someone who had seen the pattern before. The costume fitting where the comments were slightly different in tone. The casting conversation where the production director's attention drifted in a way it had not previously drifted. The sense, arriving gradually and then all at once, that the accumulated investment of years was being evaluated not as an asset but as a liability, evidence of time passing in an industry that preferred its women to appear untouched by time's passage. The cruelty of this was structural rather than personal, which is a distinction that did not make it less cruel but does explain its consistency. The Las Vegas showgirl image required youth because youth was legible to the audience as a component of the fantasy being sold. This was not a decision made by any individual producer with specific malice toward any specific woman. It was a preference baked into the product definition, reproduced every time the casting decisions were made, and enforced through the accumulated effect of hundreds of individual choices that each seemed reasonable in isolation and formed, collectively, a wall. Women in their late 20s began to feel the edge of it. Women in their early 30s were often past it, in the industry's estimation, regardless of their physical condition, their skill level, or their professional value to the production. The featured dancers aged out faster, because the technical demands of the movement roles were less forgiving of the small accumulations that years of physical work produced. The showgirls proper lasted slightly longer, because presence and carriage and the particular quality of magnetism that the role required did not necessarily decline on the same timeline as explosive physical capability. But not much longer. The window was narrow, and the industry watched it close, with the attentiveness of people managing a perishable resource. What made this particularly sharp was the complete absence of any pathway for the accumulated knowledge and experience to be formally valued. In most professional fields, the person who has done something for 10 years is more valuable than the person who has done it for 2, and the compensation and status reflect this. In the Las Vegas showgirl industry, the 10-year veteran was not more valuable, she was more expensive and less new, which was effectively less valuable. The years were not an investment. They were a countdown. The women who understood this earliest in their careers were better positioned to plan for the transition. Many understood it only when the transition was already underway. Every showgirl's career ended, and it usually ended on someone else's timeline. The exit from a Las Vegas production could come in several forms, none of which were particularly ceremonious. You might be let go quietly, a conversation in the production office, a final paycheck, a thank you that contained no specific information about what you were supposed to do next. You might be told that the show was making changes, which was a phrase that meant you were one of the changes. Or your body might make the decision for you, an injury that couldn't be ignored, a measurement that shifted, a year in which everything hurt more than it had the year before. The industry had taken what it needed. The exit was your problem to manage. The production office conversation, when it came, was brief. The language used was the language of all professional exits. Professional, impersonal, constructed to minimize the legal surface area of the transaction while also moving it to completion as quickly as possible. There was rarely an explanation that felt complete, because a complete explanation would require an honest accounting of the reasons. And the honest reasons: you are too old, the measurements have changed, we want someone newer, were reasons that the industry preferred to leave implicit. You read between the lines. You had been reading between the lines for years. This was just the final paragraph. The costume was returned. This detail mattered more than it should have, perhaps, but it mattered. The physical act of handing back the thing you had been built around, that had been fitted to your specific body and attached to your specific shoulders and carried by your specific neck for however many seasons, being separated from it and watching it go back on the hanger for someone else. The rhinestones did not know the difference. The feathers were indifferent. The costume would be refitted and relaunched within weeks. You would not. What came immediately after the exit was a period of disorientation that most women who went through it described with a consistency, suggesting it was a universal feature of the transition rather than an individual response to it. The schedule that had organized every day for years was simply gone. The alarm that had gone off at 5:30 had no reason to go off. The dressing room, where you had spent more waking hours than your own apartment, was a room you no longer had access to. The community of women who had shared the experience, the dressing room, the two shows, the feet, the smile, was still there, but you were no longer inside it. You were outside it, watching the production continue without you, which it did, because productions did not pause for exits. The financial reality of the transition was immediate and concrete. The weekly paycheck had stopped. Whatever savings existed, and for many women, on a showgirl's salary, savings were modest, were now the buffer between the exit and whatever came next, and the buffer was finite. The pressure to figure out what came next was real and pressing, and it arrived at the same time as the grief of the exit itself, which was a combination that was not gentle. Women made decisions in this period that they sometimes reconsidered later, when the immediate pressure had eased and the longer view was available. Some of those decisions worked out, some did not. The industry that had shaped them so specifically for its own purposes had not, in any of its years of taking, invested anything in preparing them for this moment. The women who spent their 20s and early 30s as Las Vegas showgirls left the stage with a very particular set of skills: discipline, physical endurance, stage presence, the ability to smile through almost anything, and found that these skills were not always legible to the outside world. Some became choreographers, which was a natural transition for those who had spent years watching how productions were built from the inside. Some moved into teaching dance. Some married and left Las Vegas entirely, settling into the kind of ordinary life that the showgirl years had made feel, for a while, like a very distant country. Some stayed in Vegas, took other work, and watched the industry they had built slowly transform around them. The choreography path was available to the women who had developed, over years of performing, a sophisticated understanding of how bodies moved in space, and how that movement could be shaped toward a theatrical effect. They had been the subjects of choreography for their entire careers, and had absorbed its logic from the inside. They knew what worked and what did not, what was physically possible for a body in a headdress, and what was theoretical, what an audience saw, and what they missed. This was real knowledge, professionally applicable, and the women who made the transition into choreography brought it with them. Some of them rebuilt the productions they had performed in. Some of them built new ones. A few of them became the people sitting in the folding chair at the front of the audition room, watching 40 women line up and calculating the same things that had once been calculated about them. Teaching was a different kind of continuation, less visible, less glamorous, and in its way more lasting. The dance studios of Las Vegas and the surrounding cities accumulated, over the decades, a faculty that included women who had performed in the major strip productions and brought their specific, hard-earned knowledge into the room with them. They taught technique, but they also taught the less codifiable things: how to carry yourself on a stage, how to manage a performance smile, how to be physically present in a way that reads across a large room. Their students received, without always knowing it, an education assembled from the experience of women who had learnt it under the most demanding possible conditions. The women who left Las Vegas entirely often described the departure as a second exit from the job and from the world the job had built around them. They moved to cities where no one knew what they had done, where the years on the strip were a story they told at dinner parties, and that people received with a mixture of fascination and polite incomprehension. They rebuilt lives organized around different schedules and different demands and found, with varying degrees of ease, that the discipline the job had installed in them was genuinely transferable. You could apply the same commitment to a career in real estate or nursing, or running a small business that you had applied to walking in a straight line under a 35-pound headdress. The skill set was different. The underlying architecture, show up, do the work, maintain the standard, do not drop the headdress, translated with surprising fidelity. What many of them carried, regardless of where they went and what they did, was a body that remembered. The posture remained. The walk, refined over years of stage performance, did not entirely disappear into ordinary gait. Women who had spent a decade as Las Vegas showgirls moved through the world with a particular quality of physical presence that did not announce itself, but was consistently perceptible to anyone paying attention. It was the last thing the job gave them, after the paycheck stopped and the costume was returned and the dressing room door closed for the final time. The body had been changed, and the change was permanent, and it was theirs. Whether a Las Vegas showgirl in the 1970s was covered by a union, and what that coverage actually meant in practice, was a question with a complicated answer. AGVA, the American Guild of Variety Artists, represented many of the performers in the major productions, and union membership provided a floor of protections, minimum wages, some working condition standards, a mechanism for grievances. In theory, in practice, the relationship between the union, the hotel casinos, and the performers existed in the same legally creative environment as everything else in Las Vegas at the time, and the gap between what the contract promised and what actually happened in the production office was sometimes significant. A showgirl who pushed too hard on a grievance might find that the industry had a long memory. AGVA had been founded in the 1930s to represent the performers who worked in venues outside the traditional Broadway and Hollywood systems, variety performers, nightclub acts, the circus workers and showgirls and specialty acts, who constituted a large and largely unprotected portion of the American entertainment workforce. By the 1970s, the union had contracts with most of the major Las Vegas hotels and provided its members with minimums that were meaningfully better than what the unorganized market would have produced. This was real and it mattered. The floor was not high, but it was a floor. The enforcement of that floor was, however, an ongoing project rather than a settled condition. The hotel casinos of the 1970s were not organizations that had internalized the spirit of labor agreements alongside their letter, and the creative interpretations of contract language that characterized their approach to wages and working conditions required constant monitoring and occasional confrontation to address. AGVA had shop stewards in the productions, cast members who served as the union's presence on the ground and whose job was to notice when the contract was being honored in letter but not in spirit, which was frequent, and to escalate when it was being honored in neither, which was not uncommon. The position of shop steward in a Las Vegas showgirl production was not a comfortable one. You were a performer in the production, dependent on the production for your livelihood, and simultaneously the person the production management knew was monitoring their compliance. The social dynamics of this arrangement were not subtle. Shop stewards who were effective at their jobs, who filed grievances, who pushed back on conditions, who organized their colleagues to understand their rights, developed professional profiles that the industry noted. The union protected them from direct retaliation in ways that the contract specified, and the industry found ways to work around this protection in ways that the contract did not anticipate, because people who are creative with money are also creative with workarounds. For the majority of showgirls who were not shop stewards, the union existed as a background condition, a set of minimums that defined the floor of what they could expect, a mechanism they could theoretically access if something went seriously wrong, and a dues payment that left them with the general understanding that they had representation. Whether that representation was fully available to them in practice was a question that most of them never tested. Either because the conditions of the job fell just within the contract's tolerances, or because the personal cost of testing it was higher than the benefit. The union was there. The union was also, in the specific landscape of 1970s Las Vegas, doing what unions do in environments actively hostile to their existence, its best, under difficult conditions, with imperfect results. Not every showgirl accepted the terms of the industry without question, and the 1970s, a decade defined, among other things, by women deciding that accepting the terms of industries without question was no longer the plan, produced a generation of performers who pushed back in ways large and small. They asked about pay. They organized. They talked to each other about what they were being paid, which was technically against the rules, and found that the rules had been designed to prevent exactly this kind of conversation for a reason. The women who negotiated harder, who refused certain demands, who left productions over conditions and talked publicly about why, they made the job incrementally better for the people who came after them. The conversations about pay happened in the dressing room and the parking lot and the late-night diner, in the spaces where the production's surveillance did not reach, in the lowered voices of women who had correctly assessed the risk they were taking by having them. What they found, when they compared notes, confirmed what most of them had suspected. The pay was inconsistent in ways that had no relationship to the quality of the work. Women who had been in the production for 3 seasons were sometimes earning less than women who had arrived the previous year and had negotiated more confidently from a position of relative ignorance. The differentials were not enormous in absolute terms. They were enormous in what they revealed about the system's priorities. Armed with this information, some women went back to the production office and had different conversations than they had previously had. The negotiations that resulted were not always successful. The production management had considerable practice at these conversations and had developed a range of responses calibrated to each level of pushback. But some of them produced better outcomes, and the outcomes that were better for one woman raised the floor slightly for the woman who came after her, because the production had now agreed to a number and would have difficulty retreating from it without the kind of visible inconsistency that created further problems. The women who left productions over conditions and described their reasons publicly were taking the larger risk and producing the larger impact. A showgirl who walked away from a job at the Stardust and told a reporter from the Las Vegas Sun why was doing something that the industry found genuinely threatening, not because of the individual story, but because of what it represented. Individual stories aggregated into patterns, and patterns attracted the kind of institutional attention that the hotel casinos had significant interest in avoiding. The 1970s were a decade when such stories were increasingly findable by journalists who were increasingly interested in telling them. The changes that accumulated from this pressure were not dramatic. There was no single moment, no landmark case, no production-wide transformation that fixed everything at once. What happened was slower and less visible, a gradual adjustment of norms, a slight shift in what the industry understood it could get away with, a marginally better floor for the women who came after. It was not enough. It was something. The women who produced it did so at personal, professional cost, which is the price of making anything better for anyone else, and they paid it with the specific kind of clear-eyed decision-making that characterized the best of them throughout their careers. The showgirl was not just a performer in a production. She was an idea that Las Vegas had built an enormous amount of its identity around, and this meant that her actual experience was always competing with the version of her experience that the city needed to project. The promotional image, glamorous, effortless, joyful, decorative, existed in a very different universe from the woman who had been awake since 5:30, was on her second show of the night, and was calculating whether her feet would survive the finale. Both versions were real. Las Vegas sold one of them and quietly relied on the other. The image of the showgirl had been assembled over decades from a set of sources that were themselves partly fictional. The Folies Bergère in Paris, from which the Las Vegas productions drew their names and their aesthetic logic, had been a theatre of spectacle and feminine display since the 1800s, and the idea of the showgirl as icon had accumulated layers of cultural meaning long before the first feathered headdress was fitted in a backstage dressing room on the Strip. Las Vegas inherited this mythology and amplified it in the way that Las Vegas amplified everything: larger, brighter, louder, more aggressively available to the tourist imagination. The woman at the center of the mythology was a construction. She was tall and magnificent and appeared not to work at being either. She existed in a perpetual state of radiant readiness that the promotional material suggested was simply her natural condition, the way some people are always punctual or some people always smell like cedar. The construction required a great deal of actual labor to maintain: the rehearsals, the fittings, the 2 shows, the feet, all of it. And the labor was deliberately invisible, because visibility would have undermined the message. Effortless was the product. Effort was the backstage. Las Vegas needed the showgirl image to hold because the image was doing real work for the city's economy. The showgirl on the billboard was not just advertising a specific production, she was advertising Las Vegas itself, the idea of Las Vegas, the promise that the city made to every person who saw her face between the highway and the airport. She represented the abundance that Las Vegas was selling, the sense that here, in this city, beauty was unlimited and available and organized for your pleasure. It was a powerful promise, and it was a false one, and it worked for decades, because the women who lived the false one professionally were good enough at their jobs to make it look true. What the city did not build, in its decades of using this image, was any infrastructure for the women who produced it. There was no institutional acknowledgement that the showgirl was a skilled professional doing demanding work, no career development pathway, no retirement provision, no health support commensurate with the occupational demands of the role. The city took the image and reinvested it in itself, endlessly, on billboards and brochures and matchbooks, and the women who had produced the image went home to their apartments off Flamingo Road and set their alarms for 5:30. The gap between the mythology and the reality was the space in which the actual lives were lived. It was not a small space. It was where everything important happened. The 1970s was, in retrospect, the last era of the showgirl as Las Vegas had invented her. The full-scale, feathered spectacular, the live orchestra, the hundreds of rhinestones per costume, the kind of production that required months of rehearsal and a cast that was genuinely trained, genuinely working, and genuinely magnificent. The corporate buyouts of the 80s and 90s changed the economics of Las Vegas entertainment in ways that made these productions increasingly expensive and increasingly rare. The Jubilee at Bally's lasted until 2016, longer than almost anyone expected, but when it closed as the last of something, a form of spectacle that had been entirely specific to a time, a city, and a set of conditions that would not come around again. The economics of the classic showgirl production were, by the standards of the corporate entertainment industry that arrived with the buyouts, straightforwardly irrational. A live orchestra meant union musicians, which meant significant payroll, which meant a cost structure that a pre-recorded soundtrack could eliminate entirely. The costumes, hundreds of them, each custom-built, each requiring ongoing maintenance and occasional replacement, represented a capital investment that was difficult to justify to a spreadsheet. The cast size, the rehearsal period, the production values that required genuine skilled labor to achieve, All of it added up to a number that the new owners found uncomfortable and that the old owners had never really examined, because the old owners had other methods of managing their financial concerns. The transition from the mob-adjacent casino culture to corporate ownership was not instantaneous and was not, in the first instance, as damaging to the Showgirl productions as it would later prove. The corporations that bought the hotels in the 80s inherited going concerns, productions that were established and profitable and that the new owners were initially inclined to maintain. The changes came gradually, driven by the quarterly earnings logic that corporate ownership imports into every industry it enters. Where can costs be reduced? Where can revenue be increased? What is this operation optimized for? And is the answer to that last question what we want it to be? The live orchestra was the first significant casualty in many productions, replaced by recorded music that sounded approximately similar to the audience and cost approximately a fraction as much. The cast sizes shrank. The productions that survived the transition were, by the 90s, operating with smaller casts, lower costume budgets, and a general ratcheting down of ambition that was not always visible in the final product, but was deeply visible to anyone who had been in the room when the product was different. The women who had been in the classic productions, and who moved into the leaner ones that followed, described the difference with a precision that money could not measure and that the corporate entertainment industry had no mechanism for. Registering, the Jubilee's closing in 2016 was marked by the kind of retrospective attention that tends to arrive just as something is definitively gone. The documentaries, the newspaper features, the interviews with the women who had performed in it across the decades. The coverage was warm and respectful and came about 30 years too late to do the women. It celebrated any practical good. The headdresses went to the Nevada State Museum, which is the correct place for artifacts of a specific and irreplaceable form of American cultural production. The stage went dark. The dressing room was cleared. The last golden age of the Las Vegas Showgirl ended not with a flourish, but with a closing notice posted on a Backstage bulletin board, which is how most things end in the theatre, and which is never how it should feel, and always does. After everything, the auditions, the headdresses, the 2 shows a night, the measurements, the rules, the feet, the age problem, the exit with no ceremony, what the showgirls of Las Vegas in the 1970s were left with was something the rhinestones had always been obscuring, an extraordinary amount of strength, not the performed, decorative kind. The real kind, the kind that is built by showing up exhausted and doing the work anyway, by carrying weight that was not fairly distributed and not dropping it, by being dismissed as decoration while doing something that required years of serious physical and professional development. They were not what the posters said they were. They were considerably more. The strength was physical first, because it had to be. You could not do what the job required without a body that had been built, through years of work, into something genuinely capable. The muscles that held the headdress, the legs that absorbed the stage impact twice a night, the feet that went on long after any reasonable evaluation would have suggested they stop. These were not the bodies of women who had wandered into a glamorous role by being pretty in the right city at the right time. They were the bodies of athletes who had trained for and maintained a demanding physical practice over years, under conditions that did not support recovery, without the acknowledgement that athletes receive for exactly this kind of commitment. The physical strength was real, and it was earned, and it was, in the industry's accounting of what it was paying for, invisible. The resilience was built on top of the physical strength and required different materials. Resilience, in the specific conditions of the Las Vegas showgirl world of the 1970s, meant continuing to perform at a high standard in an environment that was indifferent to your well-being, navigating a set of structures that had been designed by and for people with more power than you, and maintaining both the performance smile and the private self behind it with enough consistency that the job got done and the person doing it did not entirely disappear. This is not a small thing. It is, in fact, a rather large thing, and the women who did it for years did it without institutional support, without formal recognition, and without the cultural language that would later develop to describe what they had been navigating. What many of them discovered, in the years after the exit, was that the strength the job had built was transferable in ways they had not anticipated. The discipline required to show up every day to a demanding physical practice, regardless of how you felt, translated directly to whatever came next. The stage presence, the ability to occupy a room, to command attention, to project a quality of confidence that read across a large space, did not stay backstage when the career ended. Women who had been Las Vegas showgirls walked into job interviews and parent-teacher conferences and difficult conversations with the particular bearing of people who had once stood at the top of a staircase under 2,000 watts of stage lighting and descended it correctly. The headdress was gone, the carriage remained. The city of Las Vegas made them into icons and treated them as inventory. History has been slow to correct this framing, though the correction is underway. The women who wore the feathers and carried the weight and smiled through the midnight show and drove home to the apartments off Flamingo Road and set their alarms and came back, they were not decorations. They were the show, and the show, when the lights finally went down for the last time, was everything they had given it, and it was extraordinary, and it was theirs. Every major Las Vegas production in the 1970s was built around a headliner, the named act, the star whose face appeared on the marquee and whose contract represented the largest line item in the production budget by a considerable distance. Frank Sinatra, Tom Jones, Sammy Davis Jr., Engelbert Humperdinck. These were the names the audience came for, the names that filled the showroom tables and justified the 2-drink minimum and gave the hotel something to put on the billboard above the showgirl's image. The showgirl framed the headliner got the billing. This arrangement was understood by everyone involved and commented upon directly by almost no one. The relationship between the headliner and the showgirls who shared his stage was, in practice, highly variable and entirely dependent on the specific person holding the headline slot. Some of the major stars of the era were genuinely collegial, men who had come up through the entertainment industry's harder schools and who recognized in the showgirls a professionalism and work ethic they respected. They learned names. They acknowledged the cast. They understood that the production surrounding them was not scenery but skilled labor, and they treated it accordingly. These headliners were remembered with warmth by the women who worked alongside them, and the memories were specific enough to be credible. Others operated with the assumptions that significant fame and the social architecture of Las Vegas in the 1970s jointly produced. Assumptions about what the women around them were, therefore that extended beyond the professional and into territory that the women navigated with the careful, practiced diplomacy of people who needed the job and understood the power differential precisely. The casting couch was not a metaphor in this industry. It was a piece of furniture in a specific kind of room, and the path around it required negotiation that was never acknowledged as negotiation, because acknowledging it would have required acknowledging the room. The showgirls who shared stages with the major headliners of the era developed a collective and largely unwritten knowledge about which situations required careful management and which did not. This knowledge was passed between cast members with the efficiency of information that people need in order to stay safe, which meant it traveled quickly and was retained reliably. A new cast member who was about to encounter a particular situation for the first time would find, if she was paying attention, that someone who had encountered it before had already found a reason to mention what she needed to know. The dressing room protected its own in the ways it could. What the headliner system also produced, for the showgirls, was a front-row education in how star power operated, how it was maintained, how it was performed, how it interacted with the other people in the room, and what it cost the people adjacent to it to keep it running smoothly. Women who later moved into production or choreography described having learned from years of watching the headline slot from the wings a great deal about stagecraft and audience management and the specific techniques by which a performer made a large room feel intimate. It was an education delivered without any intention of delivering it, by people who were mostly thinking about themselves. The showgirls were thinking about many things simultaneously, which was, by that point in their careers, simply the job. The marquee, when the production finally closed, remembered the headliner's name. The showgirls were always, on the marquee, simply part of the show. They had been part of the show. They had also, in the ways that mattered and that the marquee could not measure, been rather more than that. Not every showgirl left Las Vegas when the career ended. Some of them stayed, and the ones who stayed built a second life in the city with the specific resourcefulness of people who knew it from the inside. Not the version the tourists saw, not the version on the billboards, but the working version, the backstage version, the version organized around early alarms and hard floors, and the community of people who produced the spectacle that everyone else came to consume. They knew where the good late-night food was. They knew which neighborhoods were actually livable. They knew Las Vegas the way you only know a place when you have spent years in its infrastructure rather than its lobby. Some of them stayed because the city was simply home by then, the place where their friends were, where their routines were established, where the geography had become familiar in the way that geography becomes familiar when you have driven the same streets for a decade. Leaving would have required rebuilding everything from scratch in a place that did not know them, and the calculus of that rebuilding did not always favor departure. Las Vegas, for all its strangeness, was comprehensible to the women who had lived inside it. They understood its systems. They knew how it worked. Starting over somewhere that operated by different and unfamiliar rules was its own kind of risk, and not everyone chose it. Others stayed, because the industry, even after their performing careers ended, still had uses for their expertise. The choreographers and teachers we have already discussed, but there were also the wardrobe supervisors who had spent years in the costume department and understood the construction of a showgirl production from a perspective that no design school could replicate. There were the stage managers who had once been performers and who brought to the organizational demands of production management the specific understanding of someone who had been on the other side of every decision being made. There were the women who worked in casting, who sat in the folding chair at the front of the audition room and watched new women line up, and who brought to that evaluation a knowledge that was both technical and deeply personal. The women who stayed also became, over time, the memory of what the job had been, the living archive of a form of entertainment that was changing, and then changed, and then gone. When the corporate era arrived and the productions began their long contraction, the women who had performed in the classic versions of those shows were still present in the city, still working in various capacities in and around the industry, and still possessed of a clear-eyed assessment of what was being lost. They did not romanticize the past. They had lived it too specifically for romanticism, but they knew the difference between what the productions had been and what they were becoming, and they named the difference accurately because accuracy was a habit the job had built. What the women who stayed left behind, when they eventually retired from the industry entirely, was a body of institutional knowledge that Las Vegas did not always know how to value and did not always preserve. Some of it was captured in interviews and documentaries and the occasional academic project by a researcher who had figured out that the real history of Las Vegas entertainment was in these women's dressing rooms and not in the hotel. Archives. Most of it dissipated the way all embodied knowledge dissipates, gradually, as the people carrying it aged and moved on, and eventually stopped being available to ask. The city they had built, show by show and night by night, kept running without them. It always did. That was the job. You built the thing, and the thing continued, and you were not in it anymore, and the rhinestones caught the light for someone else, and the show went on. So tonight, as you lie in your clean, quiet bed, no headdress required, no midnight show to dress for, no dresser waiting with a corset, and a countdown, take a moment to think about the women who built one of the most spectacular forms of entertainment America has ever produced, and who did it largely without credit, without ceremony, and without anyone asking whether the weight they were carrying was fair. They woke before the city did. They rehearsed until their bodies memorized things their minds had long since moved past. They carried architecture on their heads and called it a costume. They smiled through pain that had no official name and performed through exhaustion that had no official remedy, twice a night, 6 nights a week, in a city that used their image to sell itself and considered that a reasonable exchange. They were not what the posters said. The posters said effortless. The reality was the opposite of effortless. It was one of the most sustained and demanding physical and professional commitments that American entertainment has ever asked of anyone, dressed up in feathers and rhinestones, and presented to the world as decoration. The world accepted this framing for a long time. The women living inside it knew better. And they knew it every morning at 5:30 and every night at 2 in the morning, and in the specific language of bruised feet and aching necks, and the quiet solidarity of a dressing room that held, between its mirrors and its vanity lights, more truth than any billboard on the strip. And yet, they loved it. Many of them loved it with a completeness that coexisted with everything difficult about it, the way that genuinely loving something complicated is different from loving something simple, more textured, more honest, more real. The stage was real. The spectacle they built together was real. The live orchestra swelling under a full showroom, the lights hitting the sequins and scattering across 2,000 upturned faces, the particular electricity of a production running perfectly at full capacity. That was real, and it was theirs, and no accounting of the industry's failures changes what it felt like to be at the center of it. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, maybe spare a thought for the woman who taped her feet in a dressing room on Flamingo Road and went out under the lights and made it look like nothing, who carried 35 pounds on her neck and smiled like it was weightless, who showed up to the midnight show having already done the dinner show, having already been awake for 17 hours, and gave the midnight audience the same performance the dinner audience had received, because that was the standard and she had set it for herself long before anyone asked her to. She did not get the marquee. She did not get the biography, or the retrospective, or the museum wing, or most of the things that history gives to people who shaped it. What she got was the stage, and the work, and the particular knowledge that what she built was extraordinary. Knowledge she carried in her posture and her walk long after the headdress was returned and the curtain came down for the last time. History is full of women who made things magnificent and received, in return, a photograph without a name. The Showgirls of Las Vegas are among them. They deserve better from the record than the record has so far provided. But tonight, at least, you know their story, and the lights are low, and it is time to sleep. Let the city keep its neon. You are somewhere quieter now, somewhere the alarm does not go off at 5:30, somewhere the floor is soft and the weight on your shoulders is nothing at all. Rest well. You've earned it. They certainly did.